Hi. Well, we're here. It's the Global Day of Jewish Learning. We are the 8 p.m. East Coast session, and we're here to study together about young Moses. And the theme for this whole day of Jewish learning that started at midnight and has continued until now has been biblical heroes and villains. And I chose someone who we often think of as a hero. He is totally the hero of the Bible, Moses. But I want to pick up his story from a place where I think he wasn't sure if he is a hero or a villain of his own story. What we're going to do together is we're going to read the biblical text from Exodus chapter 2, and then we're going to look at some traditional commentaries on that, written in the Middle Ages, and one written in Tunisia in the 19th century, which is my personal favorite, and then also see some modern responses from Franz Kafka and from Yehuda Amichai, an Israeli poet. And that'll be the day. And we're sitting here in Philadelphia. We're lucky to be hosted by Taylor and Mariah. And we have some wonderful guests with us as well. And I hope we'll have questions both from all of you and it should be fun. And I'll just say that as we study this text, I actually want to dedicate this to Taylor, who has taught me something, and you'll see this in the text, both about witnessing and the importance of witnessing, and about hospitality, which is what I get to enjoy right now. So this session will pick up on those two on that theme of witnessing. We'll see in just a second. So before we jump into Exodus chapter 2, I want us to think for a second about the fact that with the story we're going to read now, the story of the birth of Moses and the young life of Moses, has really affected Western culture in enormous ways. Not only through the development of Judaism and Christianity and Islam as three religions that hark back to this story, but really in the sense that when we think of what it means to be a hero, what heroism looks like, we're actually harking back to Moses, even if we don't know it. Harry Potter or Superman or most of the books and movies that we're imagining hark back to two basic heroes in Western culture, Moses and Oedipus. And if you think back, actually, and this is based on a book by one of Freud's students, Otto Rank points out in his book, The Myth of the Birth of the Hero, which he wrote in the 20s and 30s, he points out that in Western civilization we have this kind of basic themes of how heroes are born. If you think about it, you could probably come up with a few of them. I'm curious if you could think of what are some things that Oedipus, Moses, Jesus, Harry Potter, Superman, and almost any other hero, mostly male hero, has in common. What comes to mind?
They overcome.
They overcome. There's an aspect of being challenged and overcoming those challenges.
Outcast.
Great. They are an outcast. They're not normal in their society, right? Usually that's played out. Well, what else? Yeah.
I was going to say they represent often people who can't represent themselves.
They are a voice to people who are disempowered, in a sense, right? But also, usually something dangerous happens to them early in life, right? Think of Oedipus. He has to flee because he will be killed. Moses has to flee because he will be killed, actually twice. Jesus is the same thing, basically mimicked over there. The stories in the New Testament are built on trying to make Jesus feel like Moses, so that there's really a connection there. Harry Potter, same thing, right? Almost killed at birth, survives that miraculously. Superman, almost killed at birth, his planet destroys, survives that. So there's a danger early in life, and they overcome that. There's also often an aspect of a secret identity. People don't know who they are. And then eventually that is revealed, and sometimes they themselves, right? Think of Harry Potter, Moses, the Oedipus, they themselves don't know who they are. Like when you start playing these games, it becomes amazing. Like how much are all heroes the same? Are we just retelling ourselves the same story over and over again? And I think that really Otto Rank's claim is that the reason why Western civilization it tells these stories again and again and again is try to get us to really be the hero, see ourselves as the heroes of our own lives, to overcome our own natural birth, to see where we came from as an optional setting, in a sense, and that we can take a journey and go out and be the heroes in our own narrative. That's kind of a very basic thing, but I want to keep that in mind. And I think also what's been fun about living in the 21st century is we've been challenging that narrative in different ways and saying, well, that's a Western Northern narrative, it's a male narrative. How are there other ways of telling the story of the hero? And maybe this shouldn't be the only one. Having said that, let's jump in right into this classic text of the hero. And we're going to read a few of the verses, and we're going to read in the translation here that you have on the text, which appears on page 1 of the PDF handouts that we put online. And I always like to just read a kind of a chunk of text to sort of get into it. I'll read, since I'm the one with the microphone. And we're reading from a translation by Everett Fox, which I'll just recommend whenever reading the Bible in translation. His translation is really one of the best. So we're in Exodus chapter 2. Moses was just born, and as we probably remember, sent, so that he isn't killed, sent into the Nile River in a little ark. And let's see what happens next. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the Nile, while her maidens walked along the Nile. She saw the little ark among the reeds, and sent her maid to fetch it. When she opened it, she saw him, the child, here, a boy weeping. She pitied him, and she said, "One of the Hebrews' children is this." Now his sister, Miriam, said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nursing woman from among the Hebrews for you, that she may nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." The maiden went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse him for me, and I myself will pay your wages." So the woman took the child, and she nursed him. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who made him her son. She named him Moshe, he who pulls out. She said, "For out of the water, Mishitihu, I pulled him." Now it was some years later. Moses grew up. He went out to his brothers and witnessed their labors. He saw an Egyptian man striking a Hebrew man of his brothers. He turned this way and that, and seeing that there was no man there, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. He went out again on the next day, and here 2 Hebrew men scuffling. He said to the offender, "Why do you strike? Are you prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moshe was frightened and thought, "Surely the matter is known." Pharaoh heard of this matter and sought to kill Moshe. But Moses fled from Pharaoh's face and settled in the land of Midian. He sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came, they drew water, and filled their troughs to water their father's flock. Shepherds came and drove them away. But Moshe rose up, he delivered them, and gave drink to their sheep. When they returned to their father Reuel, he said, "How is it that you have come back so soon today?" They answered, "An Egyptian delivered us from the shepherds, and also he drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "So, where is he? Why did you leave the man? Call gave Tzipporah his daughter to Moshe. She bore a son whom he named Gershom, sojourn there. For he said, I have become a sojourner in a foreign land." And that is almost the whole chapter, and actually right after these verses, it is where God appears to Moses with the burning bush. Now there's a lot to say about this chapter. And before we jump into the things that I want to focus on today, I just want to mention 2 things that are interesting. The first one is, Martin Buber taught us that when we read Bible, we always need to look for a leitmotif, for a word that appears again and again in the Bible, almost as if the Bible has hidden for us a certain word to draw our attention. There's one word that appears in this chapter 7 times. In the text that I quoted here, you see only 5 of them, but right before it and right after it appears as well. Anyone guesses on to what that word is that appears again and again? Notice when the daughter of Pharaoh is described as finding Moses, she saw the little ark among the reeds. Then when she opened it, she saw him. Jump down to verse 11. Moses grows up, and he goes out to witness their labors. In Hebrew, vayal, to see. And then he saw an Egyptian man. And then seeing that there was no man. At the end of this chapter, it is described that the people of Israel cry out to God. And it says that God heard their cry and God saw. This chapter is first of all about seeing, about the importance of seeing. How in a reality of oppression, what everyone does is they stop seeing. In fact, there's almost an indictment here because God is described as not seeing. Only at the end of this chapter does God see the situation of the oppression of the Israelites in Egypt. The first act of realizing that there is oppression is an act of witnessing, of seeing. But it's a delicate thing. I actually appreciate that the Bible doesn't make a big deal out of it, but it kind of weaves it in. It all starts by the daughter of Pharaoh seeing the ark. She could have ignored it. She chose to see it. Moses in the palace could have ignored the Israelites. We don't even know. Does he know that he's actually adopted? Does he know that he's an Israelite? Not. He chose to see. He chose to leave the palace, leave the comforts of the palace, and meet his brothers. We're going to see that. We're going to see that's a big issue. Interestingly enough, in the English language, and specifically in American English, when we want to describe truth, truth is something that you see. Just in the construct of the English language, and it's not necessarily so in the King's English in England, right? When I say I see, what I mean is I understand, right? And we say seeing is believing. I saw the need, right?
The light.
I saw the light, right? There's all metaphors of vision are metaphors of truth. Other societies, other languages, sometimes it's audible metaphors or touch metaphors. In English, and specifically in American English, it's seeing that is believing. And that's interesting in its own right. And we live in a generation of seeing. We can see anywhere in the world, as we're doing now online, right? You know, anyone can see us now. And yet we know also the limits of seeing. In a generation where you can see anything, can you really see anything? So I find something interesting about returning to this chapter that goes back to that very basic aspect of seeing. Let's pick back up on verse 15. At verse 15, I would say, is Moses' low point. Pharaoh heard of this matter and sought to kill Moshe. But Moshe fled from Pharaoh's face and settled in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. And I kind of want to imagine Moshe in this moment sitting by the well and having a moment of introspection. Who am I? What have I done with my life? And I would suggest that at this moment, Moses is not so happy, or doesn't have that many causes to be happy. He grew up in this palace, had a moment of courage to leave the palace, to go see the oppression of the system that he grew up in. Maybe to see the hypocrisy of his grandfather, Pharaoh, or the challenge, what the price of the comfortable living in the palace, actually the cost of that. We don't really know, does he see the Egyptians as his brothers or the Israelites as his brothers at this point? Does he know who he really is? But what we do know is he goes out, and when he sees an Egyptian man hitting an Israelite, he kind of takes revenge and hits back the Egyptian, ends up killing him. So he's a murderer. Or is he a freedom fighter? Maybe he still sees himself not as a murderer, but as a freedom fighter, and he's feeling good about himself. And the next day when he goes out again, he's like, I'm Superman. Like, I'm going to go and fix this system. I'm going to fight the power. I'm going to speak truth to power. I'm going to change. I'm an activist. I'm even willing to take on violence if necessary. And he goes out to the field again, and this time he sees two Hebrews. And he's probably expecting that the Israelites will say to him, oh, you're our hero. You saved us. You killed that Egyptian. You spoke truth to power. Hooray. What did the two Israelites say to him? They say in verse 13, right? He went out again on the next day, and here two Hebrew men scuffling. He said to the offender, why do you strike your fellow? The Israelite retorts, who made you prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? suddenly Moses understands the Hebrews, the Israelites, they don't see him as a freedom fighter. And they don't see him as a prince or as a leader. They have no interest in engaging with him. They see him as a self-appointed ruffian who's just in for trouble, or at least someone who doesn't represent them. And when Pharaoh then hears of what Moses did, Moses is the loneliest man in the world. The Egyptians no longer want him because he killed an Egyptian policeman, right? Or maybe it's discovered now that he's an Israelite. The Egyptians don't want him. The Israelites don't want him either. They just said, like, who put you a prince and judge over us? Get out of here. And Moses runs away. He runs away from Egypt, but he's still seen by other people as an Egyptian man. He runs away from the Hebrews. No one even knows that he's a Hebrew. And he sits down at the well, and he's a failure. And I would say at that moment, mostly like, at least if I was Moses, I would say, well, I had this like early sense of activism. I thought I would change the world. I thought I could go out and like just do the right thing. And it backfired. And now I lost my Egyptian side and I lost my Israelite side. Like, that's it. I'm going to just try and have normal life. And then something really interesting happens. Let's read verse 16. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came up, they drew water, and filled their troughs to water their father's flock. And then these shepherds come and drive them away. So we have these young women, 7 young women who come. It's a great, Hollywood scene. The women show just at the toughest moment of the movie. The hero's going through his dark period. That's when the female lead actress walks onto the stage, Zipporah. Everyone knows something good is going to happen. And then, of course, these evil shepherds come and run them away, and Moses can do something. And he chooses not to give up, so to speak, not to saying, well, basically everything I've done so far as an activist has backfired. He acts again. He's willing to, he sees justice, and he wants to act. Even though 2 actions so far backfired, he goes for the 3rd. This one works out pretty well, right? He kicks out the shepherds. The daughters appreciate him. They of course run away, but the Yitro, the father, is like, I love this line, right? Line 20. He said to his daughters, "So where is he? Why did you leave the man? Call him and let him eat bread with us." Like, what do you mean? He just saved you and then you leave him there at the well? Go back in and invite him in. So I said witnessing and hospitality. Here we have witnessing and hospitality. Yitro says, "Come, invite them in," and Moses, joins them and marries Zipporah. And if we would just stop there, actually, we don't know. Would Moses have gone back to Egypt? Like, from Moses' perspective, that's it. He was in Egypt. Maybe he was an Israelite at some point. Then he was an Egyptian prince. Then he was a troublemaker. They kicked him out. He ran away. He found a good wife. And it's over. He even calls his son sojourn there. Like, I'm a stranger. I'm a sojourner. I'm out of it. I'm a stranger in my own land. And that could have been the end of Moses, if not God calling him with the burning bush. Now, in some ways, I feel like in this moment, you could read Moses as either a hero, which he will later become. He has all the trappings of a hero, but he hasn't really done anything that heroic yet. And yet what's interesting is, as we read into Moses the hero, commentators are going to start saying, well, I want to make the most of young Moses here. We could say Moses until now has been a series of failures. And he ends chapter 2 basically, in my opinion, as a failure. He overreacted with the Egyptian. He gets pushed away by the Israelites who he thought maybe he was serving them. They have no interest in it. That's no way to perform social justice. That's not activism. And now he's like left his people and turning his back on them, and he's living with a nice Midianite woman. That's not much of a role model. Now, he will become more of a role model through the burning bush and, of course, through everything else he does. But now the commentators reading this chapter have to kind of go back and say, no, 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 we want to read these as actually exemplary. We're going to read these as the trappings of a young hero, as someone who we appreciate and we want to learn from. And as I want to look together with you on the next page is how do some of the commentators understand young Moses and why maybe he needed this journey, he needed to make those mistakes in order to become the hero that he will be. So we're on page 3. I'm curious even just to stop now and even recognizing that we're online as well. Any thoughts, comments so far from any of you?
Doesn't seem terribly remarkable so far.
Nothing doesn't seem so remarkable so far, right? Is this the Moses that will later give the Torah and do all these amazing things?
It's amazing that this man who later becomes the hero of the story also was raised by somebody else. So that they're granting credit to somebody else in this narrative we've written to say, okay, we're granting credit to these other people for actually raising our hero, which is quite benevolent as a group of storytellers telling this story.
Right. In other words, Moses grows up in Pharaoh's palace with the daughter of Pharaoh as his mother. But if we describe Egypt as like the house of oppression, as a place totally corrupt, Pharaoh as this evil, evil man, what does it mean that Moses grew up there? What values did he learn there? How do we imagine, is it, did he just bad upbringing? Or maybe actually you could get a perfectly good upbringing in Pharaoh's palace. And like for me, I find something a little bit more mortifying is maybe actually the palace of Pharaoh was a pretty moral place. But besides that, there was also this oppression going on, and that kind of split thing which we all know so well, right? The fact that we condone, enable, or even initiate different forms of oppression, it's not that simple that the bad guys are totally bad guys and the good guys are totally good guys. There's actually something a lot more complicated at work here. Any other thoughts on these first few steps? Okay, well, let's jump into the next set of texts. And I want to travel with you to Spain. We're going out of Egypt, out of Midian, into Spain of the 13th century. Spain of the 13th century was one of the most prosperous places for the Jewish people. Under Muslim rule, Jews were prospering in Spain in the 11th, 12th, 13th century, writing some of the best literature, best Jewish literature that we have, including some of the best commentaries on the Torah, both in Islamic Spain and Christian Spain. It all comes to an end in 1492, but we're going to focus on the good stuff for now. One of those commentators is Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra, a doctor, an astrologer, a leader, and a commentator on the Torah. And he asks a question pretty similar to what Taylor, you just asked a second ago, which is, why does God decide that the person who's going to save the Jewish people, the Israelites, in Pharaoh's palace? Well, why is that a good thing? Why would he do that? And I would suggest, by the way, you know who else is probably asking that question? Moses' brother, Aaron, right? Because when Moses shows back up and he meets up with Aaron, and maybe we don't even know if they've ever really talked as brothers before, you kind of wonder, well, why isn't Aaron the hero? Shouldn't a leader come from people? And you kind of wonder, is it maybe necessary that sometimes leaders, is the best leader someone who grows up, through the rank and file? Or to really create a revolution, you sometimes need someone totally from the outside to come in. Let's take a look and see what Ibn Ezra says, and maybe we can think of other examples in history that fit this. So on the 3rd verse in chapter 2, which we read before, Ibn Ezra says the following. He says, God's thoughts are deep, and who can understand his secrets? For he alone understands history. Maybe God turned events such that Moshe will grow up in the house of royalty so that his personality will be of the highest level in learning and behavior there, and will not be oppressed, used to being in a house of slavery. For you see that he killed the Egyptian for oppressing violently, and he saved the daughters of Midian from the shepherds who were oppressing them, preventing them from watering their sheep. And one more reason, because if Moses would have grown up among his people, they would know him from his youth and would not fear him for they would think of him as one of them. So what do you see here in Ibn Ezra's commentaries? What's he pointing out? Why is it that it was actually necessary that Moses grows up outside of the Jewish people and inside Pharaoh's palace?
He was groomed to be a leader.
The place to groom a leader is in a palace, right? What else does he throw out here?
Well, there's a suggestion that he can tolerate, something very different, or he's a kind of a margin walker in some way.
This complexity of belonging to both worlds, is that what you mean by margin walker?
Yeah.
Kind of, right?
I think this sense of fear, that you have to fear your leader, is an interesting question here. I don't know exactly what to do with that, but that they wouldn't fear him because they know that he was very human, that he killed somebody as a kid, that they wouldn't fear him. That's a big question.
Right. It's almost like he has this thing that he had to grow up. There are two things in what's going on, right? One, he says, you need to have fear, in other words, also distance from a leader. So therefore, if he would have grown up among them, he wouldn't have trusted it. And I think there's a sense of that. I don't know if you ever have a friend who's kind of risen to power, and you're like, what? They're the spokesperson for this? What do you mean? In third grade, they were like, how could I? Or even that moment where you realize that the president is younger than you are. I haven't had that yet happen to me, but it will happen at some point, right? You're learning, right? It's like, well, how can that be? Like, I expect my leaders to be people of...
Someone from online.
He's somehow aloof without familiarity. Maybe that's an advantage.
Right.
Someone from online says that he wouldn't have the mystique of the leader.
And that's, I think, another side of it, right? There needs to be that distance, the mystique, right, of a leader. We want that distance. And I would suggest, building on that specifically, if you are going to create a revolution, you need to grow up outside of that mindset. In other words, in the places in which we are oppressed, it's very hard to imagine a different world. Right? Michael Walzer, a very important philosopher here in America, has a very important book about Exodus as a revolution. And one of his points is that in order to truly create a revolution, you have to be able to imagine a different reality. And that the first thing you do to a slave is to take away their ability to imagine the world as any different than what it is that you are living in. So from that perspective, Ibn Ezra kind of helps us understand Moses had to grow up in freedom, to have a taste for freedom, to understand that what the Israelites are experiencing is slavery.
Someone also says, but there's a fine line, this is from online, there's a fine line between outside revolutionary and colonialism.
So the outside revolution versus colonialism. But what's the threat of colonialism in Moses's ability? Because if he's going to redeem, if he was coming from the palace but only trying to colonize the people more, that would be colonialism. No, but if he's going, having received, the best education from the colonials, right, but then using that to free the people, I immediately think of Gandhi, right? He had to get almost the best British upbringing. He had to spend time in South Africa in order to then go back to India and bring about a change. You need to be sometimes an outsider in that sense. But I think it's again interesting to imagine, like, Moses could have not made that choice. He could have stayed in the palace. And what happened that day that he sat by the palace window and decided to go out? How many days went by before that he didn't go out? That he stayed in the palace? Maybe almost, but no, it's too comfortable here. Almost, but what change can I really make? Right? And how many? But eventually he makes the choice. And when he makes the choice, it's a terrible day because he ends up killing a person on the first day. Let's take a look at what another Spanish commentator, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, the Ramban, Nachmanides, has to say about this moment. Because Ramban is troubled. Wait, is Moses a murderer? He says the following. For they told him that he was Jewish. They told Moses that he was Jewish. And he wanted to see them. He wanted to see the other Israelites, right? It's almost like they open up the adoption papers. You're 18 now, you can know. You actually belong to them. And his first response is, I want to go meet them. They told him he wanted to see them, for they were his brothers. And when he saw their suffering and their hard work, he could not stand it. That is why he murdered the oppressing Egyptian beater. Now, Ramban is walking on very thin ice here. Other commentators make a big point to say that the Egyptian oppressor was about to kill the Israelite, and that's why Moses had to kill him. That's sort of the standard thing. He's about to beat him, Moses beats him, so it's proportional, it's a good response, it's a full act. Nachmanides doesn't say that. He's actually admitting here that Moses is going through such psychological turmoil that he overreacts. And again, Nachmanides is less interested in, oh, is Moses a good guy, or was this a mistake or not? But he's willing to admit, like, maybe this was a mistake. Maybe this was disproportionate violence. But it also shows it's really because Moses was in such turmoil, this kind of split identity. Who do I really belong to? What side am I on? How can it be that I've been living a lie all this time? From that perspective, there's one commentary that says, from a psychoanalytic perspective, by Julius Lester, who's an African-American convert to Judaism, who writes about his own struggles with his identity. Am I Jewish? Am I African-American? How can I make those two happen? And through that, he goes into the story of Moses, and he says, Moses is in this place where he has to choose. Am I Israelite or am I Egyptian? Who am I? And his killing of the Egyptian oppressor, again, from a psychoanalytic perspective, is he's killing the Egyptian in him. He feels a need to say, I'm on this side of the story and not the other side. It's a very strong moment of sort of his killing his demons, or really almost killing off any option for him to return to normal Egyptian palace life. Let's see one more commentary on that. There's a very important moment where Moses, before he kills the Egyptian, that Moses looks to the left and he looks to the right and he sees that there is no one. He sees that there is no man. And again, the act of seeing, witnessing not only the oppression, but also witnessing that there's no one else who will stand up for the Israelites at this time, that they're just willing to let the oppression continue. And on this, now in the 18th century in Germany, Haktava Kabbalah, one of the important late commentaries on the Torah, Rabbi Yaakov Isaac of Klenberg in Germany, writes the following. Moses thought that one of his fellow Hebrew brothers who were standing around him would stand up against the Egyptian and save their injured brothers. And he saw that there was no one, he quotes. He saw that there wasn't among them a real person. And none of them took to their heart the troubles of their brother to try and save him. Not that there was no one around. Oh, I can get away with this. He wasn't trying to get away with murder. There might have been 100 people there. He suddenly realizes that none of them see what he sees. No one is willing to act. They're too scared. They're too stuck in their own conception. They're too enslaved to imagine a different reality. Here we kind of go back to Ibn Ezra, right? Moses was trained in a different way. He was taught, he knew the taste of freedom. He knew that he could expect something better. He was the only person there. And from that perspective, I find this interesting for our learning here about heroism. Moses doesn't necessarily see himself as a hero. He just sees himself as a person. He's just doing what he believes any person would have done in a similar situation. And that's why he acts. And I find that actually to be very touching for me, because I think heroism is a very heavy mantle. And it's a dangerous one, and we're careful of that. But often the simple acts that maybe later on get interpreted as heroism are when we're saying, like, I'm just doing what anyone would have done in my situation. It's kind of anti-heroic thing to say. Turns out that it backfired, but then the backfire backfired, right? And this became one of the most important moments for Moses. Before we continue to the next page, just curious again, open comments, thoughts, either from online or from any of you. What struck you so far? Maybe something totally opposite to what I've been claiming so far. There are many ways to read the text.
It's interesting to hear that idea of him being, if anything, surprised that no one else responded in the same way. That there's this sort of loneliness that descends on him. But, it felt normal.
It also accentuates the extreme oppression of those who didn't act, because they can't even imagine that would be the human thing to do, because they're so mired in their oppression.
Right.
And him in the leadership role, standing up, is the only real person. It's not, I think, what anybody would do. It's what anybody should do. And it took a leader, maybe somebody who'd been groomed to be one, to stand up and do what nobody else was able to do.
Is this when you saw that no man was there, no one was there? Is this language that in this new text, the Rabbi Jacob Isaac text that you've just shared with us, is this actually in the Hebrew language, no real person, the distinction of real person, or?
Right, it's good. No, it's not any real person. It's in verse 12, he turned this way and that, and seeing that there was no man there, he struck down the Egyptian. Vayar ki ein ish. So it's not real man, but in the way that we speak about men, like we have there's no man, right? There were people there, but there wasn't a man, someone who would stand up for his rights. I mean, with the gendered lens, it's very interesting to look at that, right? They were feminized by the project of slavery, right? He was brought up to be a man, and in fact, that's actually what we read. And if you notice, if we do one more textual point here, it's always good to read the text very closely. In verse 10, it describes when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. So Moses grows up in his mother's home and then goes to Pharaoh's home. And then in verse 11, now it was some years later, Moses grew up. What do you mean he grew up? He just grew up in the verse before. Moses grows up twice. He grows up once as an Israelite, and once as an Egyptian. And both of those upbringings are warring inside him. But maybe also both of those upbringings are making him a real man, so to speak. And when no one else is a man, he is willing to stand up. In Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, we say, "B'makom she'ein anashim, hishtadel liot ish." In a place where there are no people, try to be a person. I have 3 daughters. When I put them to bed, that's part of what we say at the end of the nightly Shema. But they're girls, so I say, "B'makom she'en anashim hishtadli liot isha." In a place where there are no people, try and be a woman. So it's interesting how you play with that. Be a man, be a woman, be a person.
And here, of course, it was 2 mothers that raised him. But it was interesting because here is the Israelite mother who actually raised him also.
That's true.
Which I forgot that.
Right, that she was there. And in fact, interestingly, Pharaoh's daughter is called Bat Paro, the daughter of Pharaoh. In the Midrash, in later Jewish interpretations of the Bible, they give her a different name. They call her Batya. Batya. Batya means daughter of God. So just like Moses chose the Israelites over the Egyptians, Batya, the daughter of Pharaoh, chose to be the daughter of God and not the daughter of Pharaoh. And there's something very interesting about that, right? She chose a different lineage for herself based on her moral actions. If I remember at the end of this, 5 minutes before the end, I'll tell you one more story about. Let's go on. We have been in Egypt. We've been in Spain. We've been in Germany. On page 4, I want to take you to Tunisia. Not often enough do we study, I believe in Jewish text study, commentaries written by countries after the Spanish Inquisition, as we say. Too often we kind of think of Judaism as something that is mostly happening in European lands and Christian lands before Jews find themselves in America or Israel. And there's actually an ongoing project of trying to bring out the voices that often in our Eurocentrism we ignore, voices of rabbis, many of them some of the most brilliant rabbis of the last few centuries who lived in Muslim countries. One of those is Rabbi Moshe Chalfon HaKohen. Rabbi Chalfon lived in Tunisia, was born in 1874 from a lineage of priests and a lineage of rabbis, and actually was considered one of the most wonderful leaders in his town of Jerba. Passed away in 1950. When he died, it is said that almost all the residents of the small island of Jerba came out to his funeral. The Jews and the Muslims, the French and the Berbers, they all followed his casket to the gravesite. Jerba, by the way, I've never been there. I hope to go one day. It's a fascinating place. It's an island right off the coast of Tunisia, in the Mediterranean. And it's a site of one of the oldest Jewish communities ever, continuous. It has the oldest used synagogue in the world. And also, interestingly, almost all the Jewish residents of Jerba, most of them immigrated to Israel in 1956, around a lot of Muslim Jewish in North Africa. But they were almost all priests in Jerba. So there's a well-known series of stories and halachic responses. But what do you do when the whole community is priests? It creates all kinds of problems. And very random note about the island of Jerba in Tunis is that's where they filmed some of Star Trek. So if you're a Star Trek fan, Jerba, you might go to Jerba. You'll recognize it from some of the scenes. But here in this island of Jerba, home of one of the most interesting Jewish communities, Rabbi Chalfon HaKohen writes a book in the 1930s, actually at the time of World War II and right before it, and he calls his book Darkei Moshe, the Pathways of Moshe, referring to himself, Moshe, but also referring to Moses. And it's a commentary on every one of the weekly portions of the Torah and the moral lessons we can learn from that parsha, from that weekly portion. It's a fascinating little booklet. And within that, he reads the following things. It's a little bit long. We'll read the first half, we'll analyze it, and we'll read the second half. Page 4, you can also follow the Hebrew on page.
And online, just one quick note, they listed the Global Day of Jewish Learning has a great event in Jerba every year.
Really?
Yes.
Amazing. We should all go there next year, inshallah. Okay. 4 actions of Moshe, our leader, inform us of his greatness of spirit. Full of divine courage, distinguished, who could not bear to see persecution and oppression, and who did all he could to save and redeem others. 1. When he was in the royal palace, Moshe went to see with his own eyes the situation of our brothers. 2. His beating the Egyptian who beat one of our fellow Hebrews. 3. His rebuke to the evil Hebrew who beat his fellow man. 4. His saving the 7 daughters of the Midianite priest Yitro from the hand of shepherds and robbers. Now, he's just summarizing what we know. Let's see what he then says from this. And from this, must every person of wide heart and Holy Spirit learn to take a stand and save his brothers and sisters from the hand of those who exploit them, especially in those places where our brothers are oppressed and tormented by those of no covenant. Moreover, when one of our fellow Jews is exploiting someone else, one cannot turn a blind eye, and action must be taken to help and rescue the oppressed. Even when the oppressed person is not of our faith, it is proper that even in such a situation, one stand in support of those that are being persecuted, because any oppressor is repulsive in the eyes of God. Rabbi Chalfon does something here. He reads the text about Moses, and he says, this is what we expect not of our heroes, of our leaders, this is what we expect of any person. And more than that, he also draws Moses' early actions not as kind of the fumbling, mistakes of a young leader, but actually as a very clear internal progression on the path of moral leadership. First of all, there is oppression. Train yourself to go out and see it. And I think there's a very important point here, actually. We don't expect you to jump to action immediately. First of all, we expect you to educate yourself about it, to go out and experience something about it. go to that place. I think it's something that I recognize I don't do often enough. Oh, I read on the news, I watch it, but just to go and see the most underserved neighborhoods in the city that you live. Go and see, while you're touring and living in the more comfortable places, go and see the place where the trouble is at. Stop by. I try in Israel when there were missiles in different parts of Israeli towns. Just go and visit there and see what people are talking about. Here in America, plenty of places to go and visit and just kind of beneath the surface. And you'll see something a little bit different. It's one of the hardest things to do, but it's right there. That's action number one. Go and see, witness. Second action is taking action. And here, it's an action that, for Rabbi Chalfon, is very clear. It's about the in-group and the out-group. The insiders and the outsiders. Now, we draw insider-outsider lines in different ways. For some people, it's Jews and everyone else. For other people, it's not necessarily the members of my religion. It's the members of my city or the members of my nation or country against other people. For some people, it goes along class lines or gender lines. We draw insider-outsider lines in all kinds of ways. And the next kind of level on the level of moral development that Rabbi Chalfon is drawing here is to support those in your in-group against attacks from the out-group. Right? So I'm going to fight for women's rights and against sexual assault. I'm going to fight for Americans and protect them from external threats. I'm going to fight for fellow Seventh-day Adventists, or for fellow Jews, right? Or for fellow Muslims, and fight for that group. That's the next step. The third step is about something in the in-group, right? Two people in your own community that are fighting with each other. And you might say, well, they're in my community, I don't want to say something, I don't want to offend, I don't want to meddle. No, even when it's in your community, if you have a clear sense of oppression and persecution, you speak up. People aren't immune from criticism just because they belong to your community, because they belong to your in-group. And finally, number 4, which we could have read as like just a little anecdote. Moses saving the Midianite girls. Okay, well, whatever. Who remembers that? It's, by the way, one of the least told stories, I think, when people study Bible. It's not the one they remember. Chalfon HaKohen, Rabbi Chalfon HaKohen says, this is the highest level. It's not just along my in-group and out-group. These are two people who I have nothing to do with. I just happen to be a tourist here in Midian. I'm on my way to somewhere else. But I end up seeing this. I have to do something. Later on, Rabbi Chalfon HaKohen will also say, and by the way, even if someone is from your group persecuting someone from outside your group, right? A Jew is persecuting a non-Jew, or a member of your social class is persecuting someone from a different social class, even then, especially then, you have to act and do something. So for Chalfon HaKohen, he learned from the story about Moses 4 basic actions that are not actions of heroism in his book. They are not actions of leadership. They are simply the basic actions that everyone should take. Now we have really just a few more minutes, and I want to encourage you to read this piece from Chalfon HaKohen because there's some very powerful statements he says. But I really want to get to the last poem on the next page. So let me just say this, say one thing that Chalfon HaKohen does say here, and he says, perhaps the most challenging thing that Moses did was that even when he was comfortable in the palace, he still went out and risked everything for his brothers. And I think often, especially the Jewish people who so often have been the victims of history and the oppressed of history, now we find ourselves more and more sitting in the comfortable palaces of Philadelphia and Jerusalem. And there are very few Jewish texts that talk about Jews having power and the responsibility that comes with it. Plenty of texts to talk about disempowered Jews, and we have been disempowered for 2,000 years. Today we find ourselves, the Jewish community finds itself in one of the most powerful places that it's ever been, in Israel and in America. There are threats, there are enemies, but we have a lot of power. We have many comfortable palaces. Specifically now, learning that lesson of Moses of going outside the comfortable palace and going out to see the oppressed from our brothers, from our sisters, and from far beyond that is perhaps one of the most basic Jewish actions that we can take and need to take more and more today. I want to end with this one poem on page. Because we spoke about heroism and leadership, but the truth is there's also something very lonely. And I think one of you mentioned this already, but the loneliness that is inherent in the life of the hero. And it's something that is not often described in the case of Moses. Here's a poem by Yehuda Amichai, one of my favorite Israeli poets, and who at the Bronfman Fellowships we almost always study his poetry, and he's spoken to our group many times in the past. He was still alive. And he wrote a brief poem about Moses' life. And he notices something that I'd never noticed before reading this poem. When Moses goes to the burning bush, his first reaction when he understands that it is God who is speaking to him is he hides his face. Moses hides his face because he's afraid to look at God, says the scripture. And then a few chapters later, Moses asks God, "Can you show me your face?" And God says, "No one can see my face and live." Amichai takes that dynamic and turns it into the following poem. We'll read it in the English. Moses, our teacher, only once saw the face of God and forgot. He did not want to see the desert, nor even the promised land, but only the face of God. He struck the rock in the fury of his longings. He climbed Mount Sinai and descended. He shattered the two tablets of the covenant, and made a golden calf. He searched in fire and cloud, but he remembered only the strong hand of God and his outstretched arm, but not his face. Just like one who wants to remember the face of a loved one, but cannot. He made for himself a mugshot, taking from the face of God, the face of the burning bush, and the face of Pharaoh's daughter, as she leaned over him when he was an infant in the basket. And he distributed the pictures to all the tribes of Israel and throughout the wilderness, but no one had seen and no one recognized. And only at the end of his life, on Mount Nebo, he saw and died with a kiss from the face of God. Amichai here weaves different moments in Moses' life and describes them as an ongoing yearning, a journey of longing for the face of God. And I think, by the way, very often in our culture we talk about how true heroism and leadership and just a good creative life will happen when all the pieces of your life is at peace and you're living a whole being and you're great. And I actually think it kind of works the opposite. Creativity and heroism and leadership and morality, sometimes they derive from a place of anguish or from a place of longing. Perhaps instead of waiting for everything to be totally balanced and wholesome, we should connect with that yearning and longing and sometimes anguish that we feel within us and act from that place. Will lead perhaps for a much better world for us and everyone around us. That's the end of our session today. Thank you for joining us in person and online. Thank you to the organizers of the Global Day of Jewish Learning. Have a good night, and I look forward to studying with you sometime soon again.
Thank you.
Thank you.